Terrestrial Mammals of Virginia, Trends in Distribution and Diversity, by Charles Handley, Jr., Division of Mammals, National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian Institute. The Europeans, 400 to 200 years BP. The equilibrium that had existed for centuries between man and beast was shattered when the Europeans landed on the shores of Virginia. Whereas the impact of Indians on the mammals had been minimal, the impact of the European colonists was profound. In place of bows and arrows and spears, the colonists brought more lethal firearms. They also brought an exploitive philosophy, and in place of village, house, yard, and garden plot, they brought the concept of fields, plantations, livestock, and cities. The early colonists were impressed with the variety and abundance of game animals and large predators wherever they landed or settled. Latecomers also reported that the abundance of large mammals, not that they saw themselves, but that they heard of on the frontiers to the west. Hunters became explorers as they ventured beyond the frontiers to find meat animals that they could barter or sell back at the settlement. Predators were extirpated to protect livestock. Fur bearers were trapped until there were too few for trapping to be worthwhile. The black rat was introduced, then later the Norway rat and the house mouse. They became feral, often the dominant animals, in fields, marshes, ditch banks, sewers, thickets, and buildings. The colonial era, 400 to 200 years BP, ended with no more frontiers in Virginia. Settlement had reached every boundary. 200 years of unrestrained exploitation primarily affected the larger mammals. The bison was gone. Elk, white-tailed deer, wolf, mountain lion, and beaver were reduced to small fractions of their pre-colonial numbers. Presumably, the smaller mammals scarcely noticed the European presence, nor did the Europeans notice the smaller mammals enough to write anything significant about them. The 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th century was the era of most severe habitat destruction in Virginia. Deforestation reached its maximum, with clearing for agriculture and clear-cutting for pulp and lumber. Wetlands were drained for agriculture, streams were polluted with sewage, mine, and industrial wastes, and extirpation of fauna was commonplace. The last of the original forest was clear-cutted, and the debris usually was burned. Forest fires were frequent and widespread. Growing on sterile ground, without benefit of long-accumulated humus and soil nutrients, successional forests were inferior to the old growth they had replaced. Trees we see today are comparatively low and scrawny, with no chance of ever attaining the status of forest giants, commonplace in the past. Most tragic for mammals was the cutting and burning of the islands of spruce and fir on the higher mountains. This hastened the demise of the boreal relics: the water shrew, snowshoe hare, northern flying squirrel, rock vole, and fisher. Most of these cling today to small fragments of only marginally suitable habitat, in numbers so small that their ultimate disappearance from Virginia is inevitable. When the European colonists replaced the park-like old-growth forest of the coastal plain with a mosaic of agricultural fields, the fox squirrel survived in small numbers, only in the most favorable habitat. However, in this century, when the old fields were abandoned and grew up to scrub pine, the fox squirrel disappeared. Mammalian extinction in Virginia peaked during this period. The last bison was killed in 1797. Porcupine, about 1837. Elk, 1855. Mountain lion, 1882. Fisher, 1890. The fox squirrel of the eastern shore, 1895. Gray wolf, 1910. Beaver, 1911. And the white-tailed deer and river otter were extirpated from most of the western Virginia early in the century. Changing land use patterns led directly to the extirpation of the fox squirrel, indirectly to the extirpation of the others, making it easier in the shrinking forests to hunt or trap dwindling populations of mammals. This era ended with an environmental disaster. The introduced chestnut blight reached northern Virginia about 1920 and had spread to the southwest corner of the state by 1930. Quickly, the oak-hickory-chestnut forest became an oak-hickory forest. The gray-white trunks of the dead chestnuts became the dominant feature of mountain forest for the next quarter century. Ecological consequences were mixed. Disappearance of the chestnut was a serious sudden loss to mast foragers such as the bear, deer, and turkey. But the standing dead trees provided optimal habitat for beetles and other burrowing arthropods, for woodpeckers, and hole-nesting birds and mammals. Later, when the dead trees fell, the prostrate trunks became habitat not only for inverts, but also for salamanders, snake shrews, chipmunk, mice, voles, and weevils. Conservation, 75 BP to present. Actually conceived in the previous era, the conservation movement has developed in the 20th century. Virginia's mammals have prospered. The U.S. Forest Service, national and state forest and parks, forest management, soil conservation, wetland preservation, federal and state game management agencies, the non-game conservation program, the natural heritage movement, private conservation organizations, and the introduction of natural resource curricula to universities all have had a profound effect on the mammalian fauna of Virginia. This has been an age of discovery, enlightenment, and recovery. The fauna has been inventoried and mapped, and much has been learned about natural history and population dynamics. The Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries now sees its role as steward of the whole fauna, not just the game and fur species. Attempts to restore lost species have been mixed. Restoration of elk and snowshoe hare have failed. Lack of suitable habitat in Virginia now compromises reestablishment of the fisher and limits the lowland fox squirrels. Reduction of pollution and trapping and return of natural dispersal aided by transplants probably will restore the river otter to western Virginia. Return of the mountain lion by informal transplants is likely to fail. Restoration of the white-tailed deer to western Virginia and the beaver to all of Virginia have been outstandingly successful, perhaps too much. Introduction of exotic taxa, as a rule, is undesirable. That certainly is true of the black and Norway rats and the house mouse introduced by the European colonists. The South American nutria has invaded the salt marshes of Virginia from points of introduction in the southern United States. It may prove to be a valuable fur bearer or perhaps more likely a pest. The black-tailed jackrabbit of the western United States, established on several islands of the eastern shore, in time probably will be considered a pest. The Japanese sika deer flourishes on Assateague Island, where it is a tourist attraction and a game mammal. The Assateague pony, touted as wild, actually is a managed domestic animal. The 400-year saga of deforestation has ended. The acreage in forests in Virginia now is greater than it was 75 years ago and continues to grow as unprofitable farms are abandoned. Species which have benefited from deforestation, the white-tailed deer, the red fox, coyotes, meadow voles, prairie deer mouse, harvest mouse, woodchucks, chipmunks, and cottontails, probably are more widespread and abundant now than they have been since the Pleistocene. Reforestation is not likely to proceed to the point of seriously diminishing populations of these animals. In fact, some reduction in their number is desirable. For example, the deer population has increased too much to be controlled by hunter-harvest in some areas, and consequent overbrowsing is damaging habitat. Increasing acreage of forest and wilderness will benefit bear, mountain lion, bobcat, gray fox, and forest rodents and shrews. Natural history. The greatest obstacle to effective management is ignorance of the basic natural history of most species. Only mammals of economic importance, mostly game, fur-bearing, or predatory species, are relatively well known. In the future, highest priority should be given to definitive studies of the natural history of these species that are threatened or endangered. Ultimately, the biology of all species should be examined, and habitat management decisions should be based on a firm knowledge of their natural history.